Y is recorded in front of a live studio audience.
Do we want to talk about the woman in the outhouse who lost her Apple
Oh my
Watch?
God, it's so gross.
Well, I feel like we discussed this before. Someone in like, I think we did. I don't know
This
if it was
particular woman? No.
no, not this woman.
No, because this is new. Not that
This
crazy.
No, but I feel like there is a
We've definitely
propensity.
talked about like porta potties and like
Yes,
what people find, because I knew that person that had the place that he had a porta potty company. We were going to try to get him to enter on the show, but we couldn't because his wife passed away. And all the stuff he used to find in there. We've definitely talked
I
about that. But okay, it's an Apple Watch. Now I love
right.
the Apple Watch.
Oh,
We, although professional, not rolling in the dough per se, I
I
would sacrifice my Apple Watch.
You would
I
forever
can't.
be wearing that or
No,
whatever
I
it
would
is you
never wear it again.
exactly. And don't tell me like, oh, just replace the band and you're fine. No, you're
Nope.
not.
No,
Nope.
no, no, no.
There
You're
is
touching the face. Oh, no.
there is no amount of sanitizer in any shape or form that could get you to like.
The thing is how far she got herself wedged. They had to remove the toilet to get her out.
This is Why, with your hosts, Heidi Hedquist and Luke Poling.
I just
And she's from Michigan, let the record show.
right. I just feel like I don't know anyone. When you are in such a location, your overarching aim, desire is to get the hell out of there.
Yes.
You're not spending extra time. You're not, let me check my email while I'm in here.
No.
Let's get through a few more rounds of levels of Candy Crush. No, you were not. No, you're get me the hell out of here. So the fact that she was like, I'm going to try to get this watch. I think I can get this watch. And then getting stuck. I would never stop gagging ever.
No, I don't know what I would actually go in to save.
I'm questioning
maybe?
kids.
I was supposed to say captain or your children.
Yeah, and even then it'd be like, you're going to have to take a long shower and it's going to be hot. Hate to break it to you.
Yes.
But even then I don't have to like have them near me every minute of every day.
Not on my body, no.
Yeah. No.
It's the grossest story. I can't even handle it.
But I feel like years ago, which here's how we've made it in this show. We've forgotten disgusting things we've discussed.
Amazing.
But I believe there was a story of people in Alaska, like in national parks and hiking trails and stuff like that. People losing something or getting stuck in there trying to retrieve something.
Perhaps.
And then how we got to call the sheriff. We got all this and like maybe it was Colorado. It seems like a Colorado kind of thing.
It does. It's vaguely familiar. Yes.
It just, unfortunately, this is not the first time we've discussed this.
No, it's probably won't be the last.
Oh, heaven help us all.
No.
Yeah. So, but let the record show you were the one that brought this upon us.
I know I was. Isn't that terrible? And it also showed that my aunt and uncle's washing machine is going right now, but it's very like sloshy. It's unusually sloshy.
Not what you want to hear right about now.
The ambiance of this conversation of making me want to just crawl.
As far as first questions go,
sure.
Do you consider yourself a photographer or a guy who just really likes to listen to music?
Well, I certainly, the part of the journey of the book was that I was doing everything as a teenager, but my whole idea was that I was going to be a filmmaker. And so, I mean, my career has been in the film business, but I've always loved photography. And looking back at it, I was selling pictures or dealing with Rolling Stone as a 20-year-old. So it was, I kind of had a very short sort of professional career. So I don't quite know how to describe it. I mean, I certainly am a big music lover, but I was a professional rock and roll photographer for a period of time. So I don't quite know how to how to answer it in terms of identity. I just love doing interesting things that are artistic, I guess, is the best answer.
And looking at the photos from the book, you had a really good vantage point for some amazing shows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was kind of the thing that looking, the whole thing with this book is I got to sort of have the whole experience and then not think about it for 30 years and then look back at it as an adult. So what I realized when I was looking at the photos, that I had a very unique vantage point, because part of it, when I went pro, suddenly now you're in the pit and you're shooting up their noses. Most of my photos are from what the viewpoint that the audience saw. So I was capturing some of these sort of legendary performers and shows from an angle that normally they weren't captured from. Because, when you like, for instance, the Police, the pictures at Shea Stadium, the professional photographers were told they had 3 songs. They were in the pit, and then they went home. I shot the entire show, and I was and that one I happened to be in the front row for a good chunk of it, but I was still in a vantage point that was different than what they were getting. So I ended up capturing it from kind of an unusual vantage point compared to most of the record of these shows in the 80s, because not everybody obviously had a iPhone at that point. So that's part of I think some of the uniqueness of the images is that it's really what the audience saw, which is not always what the professionals capture.
Yeah. Oh, go for it, Heidi. And were you going to say something? Thank God we're editing this.
Yes. In addition, it was from the vanity, even into his iPhone, with everyone thinking that they're professional or not. You captured these moments, like the expressions, you knew your instincts were so phenomenal, on top of being in that area, that oh no, I mean, I was pictures. I was that, I mean, listening on stage, I can't help but love, but it's just amazing. Amazing.
Unfortunately, I'm having trouble hearing you. I couldn't. It was very garbled.
Yeah, she was, I think, asking about the expressions and the emotions that you were able to capture. And do you think that was just being more familiar with the music to know where those crescendos and those moments were?
I think that was an element of it, and that may have been the fact that I was concurrently pursuing a career in an art that was storytelling. So when I would go to the shows, I would definitely look for the story of the show. When it would almost became, when it sort of got, when I got further into, I was bringing in more equipment, so I would almost kind of, whenever I would shoot one of the shows, I would sort of reach a point like, okay, I've kind of covered this. So now I'm going to start doing interesting things, like, oh, I'm going to, get more compositionally interesting. Like, oh, let's get a couple of lights in it. I always love to get the physical stage lights in there. So I think that just kind of came from my process, and the fact, again, that I was really studying storytelling at the time. I was pursuing filmmaking, so I would kind of look at these shows like, what's the story here within this show, and some of these were very big shows, like seeing Prince and the Police and all of that. And so that's kind of what I was capturing, and always looking for the artist doing something interesting, the emotion, and it was also the fact that, particularly when I started, I loved these performers. This was not a job to me. This was a passion. And so, I worshiped Prince and the Police when I saw these shows. And again, that was kind of part of the thing. Once I became a professional, suddenly I was getting assigned to shoot people I didn't love. And I started to notice that was apparent in the work too.
You want to name some of those people?
I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that. I love them all, but no, it's just the way it goes. I have to say, by and large, I was so obsessed with it during this period of time. Even when I say I didn't love them, I loved them. They just weren't my favorites. It wasn't the same. When I saw the Police at Shea Stadium, I just couldn't believe it. Or seeing U2 in Ireland, all these different bands were just I was so excited to see them. I mean, I was going to 5 shows a week at the peak of it. And the passion is also what kind of led to the downfall, because part of it, again, I sort of tell the story in the book, was that besides now being in college and sort of turning pro and getting asked to do all these shows, that I was still trying to study film, the conflict of it. I saw the Grateful Dead, and that just took over my life. And so suddenly I didn't, I used to, I think, again, it's in the book, I have all these lists that I would write each show I went to, and you see like the first time Grateful Dead appears, then you see a few other concerts, and you see Grateful Dead again, and then it just reaches a point where it's Grateful Dead, Grateful Dead, Grateful Dead, the whole list takes over. And then I had a moment at a Grateful Dead concert where I was photographing them, and I don't know if you ever saw the Grateful Dead or any incarnation. They're not, the stage show is not what you're there for. It's the opposite of Prince. It's the music and the jamming. And I was photographing them, and I was a few songs in, and I was like, okay, they're not going to really do anything different for the next 3 hours of the show. Plus, I want to dance. And I put my equipment down and I started dancing. And that was kind of the beginning, the end of my career, because then it was just, I just want to see the Grateful Dead. I just want to dance and you said this was an R-rated podcast. I want to take a lot of drugs and dance. And that's kind of what I did for a number of years after that. So, and had a blast.
Yeah, I don't think you were the first person that
No.
Jerry and the rest of them did that too.
Not at all. And it was a lot of fun, but it is kind of ironic, because it kind of brought kind of hastened the end of me doing it. So that was a very interesting question you started with, whether I consider myself a photographer, because I certainly consider myself, I was one then,
Mm-hmm.
and I also sometimes question, because I didn't really realize that's sort of part of the fun of youth, is that how unusual this position I had found myself in at a very young age, that I was, dealing with Rolling Stone and Spin magazine and all this stuff. And I was, again, 20, 21 years old. And I just thought, well, that's what you do. And I still considered it, even though I was working professionally, sort of as, as a hobby, because I was going to be a filmmaker. And so looking back on it, I still question whether I should have hung it up when I did, even though I've had a lot of fun with my film career. I was in a very unique place at a very young age in terms of rock photography, no question, compared to my film career.
Well, and you
Is
talk
there?
about, no, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Is there one particular photo of all the amazing shots you've taken? Is there one that's like the signature to you? Is there one that's like the focal piece of your home, or the one that is just
absolutely I'll give you I have 3 that are like the 3 that are my absolute favorites, and then one that is the favorite. The three are, I have a picture of Bono pointing into the audience. This was the second time that I saw U2. I saw them for the first time in 1983 in Ireland, which was incredible, because it was kind of it was their Irish homecoming. It was after the War album had come out. They toured the world and had become international superstars, and now they were back in Ireland for the first time in 18 months. And back in Dublin. So that show was incredible. I was like the only American there. It was on an unbelievable lineup of shows, and it was a very emotional show, because it was their return, and it was the Edge's birthday. So they brought cake out. So it was amazing. So that was the first time. I see them 18 months later in San Francisco, and that's where the photo came from. And at this point, they had started doing this thing during their show where during a certain song, they would bring an audience member up. They would literally pick somebody out of the audience, put them on stage, give them the Edge's guitar, and show them how to strum one chord, and this person would strum it, and they would leave the stage, and this person would be sitting there under the lights. And that moment I caught was Bono pointing to the person that he was going to select to bring up on stage.
Oh my God, that's awesome.
Yeah, so that's that one. And then the next one is, I have a shirtless photo of Sting at Shea Stadium.
Yes.
And what I write,
Yes.
that moment, I say, if you're looking for the definition, of a rock god, standing shirtless in front of 60,000 people at the mecca of live rock and roll, Shea Stadium, this might be the definition right here, this moment of Sting. I mean, that's where the Beatles sold out Shea Stadium, and there he is shirtless. And years later, again, when I rediscovered these photos and read about that show, they talked about breaking up after that show. They said, we've done it, where do we go from here? And then number one, and part of this group of three, my absolute favorite photo is the picture I have of Prince, where he's got his hand up and he's got the big pink boa and he's about to, hit a power chord. That's my favorite photo I ever took of anybody. That's sort of a signature shot. So those are my top three, and my top number one is definitely the photo of Prince.
And
Yes.
I don't want to say I'm confused, but I have so basically you work professionally, you put all these photos in a drawer at a certain point and then sort of rediscovered them. How does that go from like, okay, I'm on the road with the dead, clearly, like, let's just set this all aside?
Well, okay, to understand, 90% of, maybe even more, of what's in the book was not shot professionally. That's why it's called No Cameras Allowed. I was smuggling my equipment in. I just reached a point that I built up such a portfolio. I went to a couple of open calls for rock and roll photographers, and I'll just be honest, the editors looked at these pictures and shit their pants. And they hired me, and particularly, I was talking about the Bono photo. I went to this open call. There used to be this magazine, a rock and roll magazine in California called BAM, and I went in to see the editor there, and they're going through my portfolio book, and they get to that picture of Bono, pointing at the camera, and the two editors stop and they're looking at it really intently for a long time, and then they turn to me and they go, 2 weeks ago, we had a cover story on Bono, and we were looking for a photo, and they said if we had seen this photo, this would have been our cover. And so that that was sort of the level I had reached, even though I was still smuggling my equipment. And so that was when I went professional. So most of it was not professional. It was the smuggling in. It was sort of like my way of being part of rock and roll. The sort of rebellion was, oh, I'm going to break the rules, because it started with me wanting to play music, and that ended very quickly after I actually picked up a guitar. So that was the journey, and so most of it was pre-professional. So to finally answer your question, so I went professional, but then I had this moment where it was a combination of the fact that the career was taking off and I was getting calls all the time. I was now living in Los Angeles. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, but I went to Los Angeles to go to film school. I was in film school getting calls all the time to shoot shows, and I didn't have time. It's like, I'm in college. I can't, I have homework and films I'm making. So that was becoming a struggle. Also discovering the dead and wanting to sort of enjoy it. And then finally, the moment where I stopped was I had an incident at a Bruce Springsteen show where my camera jammed, and I shot basically 15 rolls of film and 13 came out blank. And so I was like, you know what? That's it. That's the sign I've been looking for. I'm going to stop doing this. So I stopped, continued following the dead, went to, finished, got my film degree, went into the film business, and just didn't even think about it. Just put this, I had over 10,000 images. This is negatives. And somehow over the next 30 years, they survived dorm room moves and after college, when you're living with three of your buddies and all that stuff. And then 30 years later, if you remember, this is like 2016, concurrently, Bowie and Prince passed away, very much on the heels of each other. So, I'm pretty active on Facebook, and I put a couple of pictures up that I had taken of Bowie and Prince. And all of a sudden I started to get inundating with these people going, why do you have these pictures? What's the story here? And I was like, whoa, okay. And somebody suggested you should do a book. And my first reaction was, well, what is the point? It's not like these people haven't been photographed before. There's lots of pictures, even though these were amazing shows. These were all people, for the most part, that were big at the time that I photographed them. So photos of them weren't rare. When I realized I had a story there was when I realized how unique it was that I did it by smuggling in my equipment, and that I could incorporate the stories into the book. Again, that it could be about storytelling. So it became a whole journey of how I first decided to smuggle my equipment into a show, and the whole journey, again, for lack of a better term, that I went on, where it got so big that I had to stop doing it, and the choice I had to make. So that's when I realized, that I can make a book, because that would be the angle that was unusual, the no cameras allowed aspect of it. So that's how it kind of all came together.
I want to get into your other work and your writing, but one more music question. How
Sure.
the hell did you grow up in the San Francisco area and only get into the Dead when you moved to LA?
It was because what I needed was the college experience. And I had seen Garcia when I was still Jerry Garcia used to play a club. I grew up in Palo Alto, California, which is actually where the Grateful Dead began. And there was a small club there called the Keystone that the Jerry Garcia band would play at. So I actually saw him there and photographed him there, but it didn't take. It's the so much of the Grateful Dead experience is community. So when it really took off was when there were 15 of us crammed in a Toyota that should hold 6 people going to a show, and that's that was the beginning when I became part of the community, and that didn't happen till I met other Deadheads in college. So that's why it didn't happen in high school or earlier. I certainly knew people, and the irony was I thought they were crazy, and then
Right.
I became way crazier than any of them.
And you must have been kicking yourself at some point, being like, I was down the street from this gig and I didn't go.
Oh, there. In fact, it's so funny you should mention that. Some of those other students in high school who I sort of mocked, who were Deadheads, I couldn't wait to see them at the reunions to go, oh my God, you were so right. I'm on the bus now, So that was really fun and I was jealous of the shows that they got to see. I have a very good friend who was about a couple years ahead of me in the whole thing, and he got to see them in venues, that they had outgrown by the time I even came along. So, yeah, absolutely.
So to move to your other writing, so how did you said you were working in film, you wanted to be a filmmaker. How does the books come about? Was this is a lot easier than putting together a budget?
The books come about because a number of factors. There's ageism in Hollywood, and I had a similar thing. I started working very successfully as a screenwriter for Disney and various studios when I was in my 20s because I was the young hot screenwriter. That's just what happens. Well, when you get around 40, you're no longer the young hot screenwriter, and that becomes a factor. And a lot of people sort of decry the ageism. I would be such a hypocrite because when I broke in, I pushed people out. It's the cycle of what happens. And the other part of it, I'll just say, as I've gotten older, the notion that I would attempt to write anything right now about what it's like to be in your 20s and dating or anything is so insane. I mean, I may get hammered by other writers who are my age, but I think that that's insane. I haven't been on a date in 20 years. I'm married, and I have no idea what it's like to in the age of these things to do all of that. So I this is going to be a terrible thing to say, but I'm almost for ageism because I think it's insane to think anybody. I'm going to get hammered, I'll get the argument like, you don't know what it's like to be a Martian, but you can write science fiction. But so that had a factor to do with it in the transitioning, because my bread and butter had kind of been romantic comedies and things like that. So that was part of the transition to books, and just frankly satisfaction. You can have a career in Hollywood. It's very strange. And I was one of those people where I was making a good living. Nothing was getting made. I was producing scripts that were either being rewritten or ending up on the shelf and all that. And there's not a lot of satisfaction in that. So I reached a point where, what, if I write a book, whatever happens with it, the actual thing that I'm writing exists and somebody can enjoy it. Nobody can enjoy a script. It's a blueprint for people to make a movie, and they can, the movie they can enjoy. So that's kind of how the transition came about. And I certainly enjoyed the freedom, when you're writing a screenplay, it has to be a certain length, a certain structure. A book, you can go anywhere and see where it takes you. And that's what happened. I really love it, much prefer it at this point.
And it's really interesting, the fact that your quote unquote first professional career involves nothing but being around people, being part of a scene, and really trying to capture that moment. And then you go into a career that involves nothing but locking yourself in a room by yourself and making yourself miserable trying to put a story together.
Well, no, you're right. I mean, I've kind of wrestled with that because I'm trying to I've had a lot of success with my latest novel, the It's Alive, about the days leading up to the making of Frankenstein, and I'm trying to get another one off the ground. And some of the fact is I'm having so much fun doing the promotion, and I've started doing these presentations related to the book where it's become like a 1 hour, one-man show. And I love that because I'm with an audience. I've done it in front of hundreds of people, at a time now. And that's so much more fun than, like you said, sitting alone, in this misery of doing it. So it's so funny you should mention that, because I am kind of struggling with it now. I'm definitely enjoying more of being in a group setting with the book events and the presentations.
So it's about the days and weeks leading up to the beginning of production on Frankenstein. Is that a good?
Yeah.
Is that an era and a genre that you just have been in love with? Because it seems like everybody loves that universal horror, especially that era, Karloff and all that.
That's exactly what it was, is that in the, around and it's funny because this leads into the rock and roll. When I was a young kid in the early 70s, I was a monster kid, which is sort of the term. I grew up watching the black and white reruns of the classic horror films. And then one of the things that, it sort of ended when I reached adolescence, because I discovered rock and roll. I discovered girls, rock and roll. You have different interests. Well, 20, 30 years later, I'm in the film business now, and I rediscovered those original Universal horror films, and they're, seeing them as an adult, there's those early ones, they're very complex, and their themes and the filmmaking is very interesting. So I saw them with different eyes, and I decided at that point, because again, I was in the film business, I wanted to look into how they were made, the behind the scenes story. So I started reading about them, and I eventually, and I was also a writer at this point. I was kind of looking like, maybe there's a story in here. There's something. These are unique films. And I landed on this character named Carl Laemmle Jr., or Junior Laemmle, as he is known. He was 21 years old, and he was running Universal Studios. So you have a 21-year-old running a movie studio. That's the first time that I went, holy shit, okay,
right.
This is interesting. And then as I read deeper, I realized he was the one responsible for these horror films. Nobody else thought it was a good idea, including his father, who had founded the story, or founded the studio. He thought it was terrible, but he wanted to and chose to make these films. So I became obsessed with wanting to find out why. Why, of all the things he could have made, why did he make these horror films? And I did a deep dive into him. And then when I sort of did all this different research, I found that there had been this interesting thing that had happened. The films that set the cycle of the Universal horror films were all made during his tenure, which was Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, and Bride of Frankenstein. And he chose to make all of them. And what was the point I was trying to make here? Oh, but when I did the deep dive, I found that there was this moment right before Dracula had been a hit, and he decides to follow it up with Frankenstein, and everybody thought he was crazy. You got lucky, Dracula turned out to be a hit. It's going to be a flop if you do it again. And I didn't realize that within the story, the casting of the role of the monster did not come down until the last minute. So I was able to find a way to tell the story from the point of view between Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, and Junior Laemmle. And that's when I realized that there was a story there. And that's kind of how I got there, because it tells their story. And all three of these men, who, particularly Lugosi and Karloff, who were so famous, their lives were never the same again. Karloff was a completely unknown, struggling actor before Frankenstein. He comes out of it a big star and is a star for the rest of his life. And Lugosi was never bigger than he was right after Dracula. And then, unfortunately, he was supposed to be in Frankenstein for various reasons, didn't end up in it. I covered in my novel. And his career never was the same after that. So that moment was the perfect way to tell that story about the origin of the cycle of those movies, that the cycle goes on for another 25 years. And like you said, to this day, we're talking about movies that are 90 years old that are still revered and loved. Universal is building a Universal Monsterland in Orlando right now as we speak. I mean, that's incredible for a bunch of black and white films that are, 90 years old. So yeah, I thought there was something interesting there, and that was the moment that I felt could tell the story of why these films were so unique and why they still survive till today.
Completely, sort of, just from your research, which Laemmle was the one that were bringing over filmmakers from Germany
That was
Before-
that was the father.
That was dad. Okay, I
That
wasn't
was
sure
dad.
which.
Yeah. No, Junior was a kid, and that was the other thing. Just as a writer, when you find these stories, what Carl Laemmle Sr. and Junior Laemmle, who we put in charge of the studio, had a very complicated relationship. It was a great father-son story. Junior takes over the studio, and like any kid with a rich father, he starts spending the old man's money and making these big, expensive productions. And he also wanted to do it a different way. It was a great father-son story. Well, what's Frankenstein ultimately but a father-son story? A creator
Absolutely.
who doesn't understand its creation. So, when you realize that kind of a parallel, you're like, as a writer, you sort of get excited. So I realized that I could tell their story that way, because Carl Laemmle Sr. was a fascinating guy. He was the one that saved a lot of Jews from the Holocaust. And there was a joke at the time, which even happened even before the Holocaust, which was Carl Laemmle has a very large family, because he hired all of his family members. There was something like 30 or 40 different Laemmles at the peak of it working for Universal. So he already had that spirit even before he had to get people out of Germany. He was a very fascinating, good man. All of the original studio guys who started the film business out here, the Goldwins and the Mayers and all those people, you read about them, and they were tough SOBs. And everything you read about Carl Laemmle, Carl Laemmle Sr., his nickname was Uncle Carl. He just seemed like the nicest man, yet he was like, I don't know how he did it. He beat Edison. I mean, he was the one who defeated Edison's stranglehold on the film business. This is real early film history. And yet the other guys, you get it. These were tough guys who fought themselves up from the streets. He was this guy who kind of had a nice kind of middle-class life his whole life, and yet built this whole empire sort of. And I still don't, I've done so much research, and I still can't quite figure out how he did it, because he just seemed like the nicest guy. You don't have all these stories of all these battles that so many of the other people did, except he did beat Edison. But even they're just fascinating characters, Carl Sr. and Jr.
That's amazing. I mean, it's so nice to hear that. It's so cheesy, but that nice guys you can actually win, and Edison deserved to be beat, right? So that wasn't bad. That was good.
Oh, it's insane. And Edison had this thing that you couldn't make features when he was controlling the patents company. You couldn't make longer than a 20-minute film. I mean, that just sounds so stupid. Like, what do you care? What you're in a
so
business.
Crazy.
Yeah, and so just
it was a lot.
Yeah, it was very strange, but fortunately they won, and obviously, the Laemmles did quite well. But
They did okay.
But part of the story this is kind of jumping ahead on Junior, but Junior ran the studio up until the mid-30s, and then the Laemmles lost Universal. They lost the studio in 1936. So when my book came, Junior Laemmle, Carl the Senior died in the late 30s. Junior lived all the way into the late 70s. So when my book came out, a lot of family members who were alive who knew him, reached out to me, and they were so thankful to see. Junior had no children, so he had a lot of cousins and stuff and nieces and nephews. They were so thankful to see him sort of getting some due. But what was fascinating was the people who knew him later in his life, the family members, they barely knew that they used to run Universal, because and it seems inconceivable to us.
Wow.
Yeah, because it seems impossible to us to understand, but to them it was a business they lost, so they didn't talk about it a lot.
Of course, yeah.
Right. And so to us, if we had anything to do with the founding of Universal Studios, that's all we'd talk about. But to them, it was like, so because I would always ask them, I said, did Junior ever talk about the horror films? And like some of them barely knew they'd been in the film business. It was just Uncle Junior or Junior, and he kept an active social life, but he never really was in the film business again after his years at Universal. So that was a interesting part of the story that I uncovered.
Oh, and given the fact that, I mean, the Laemmle family is insanely fascinating for all sorts of reasons, and like you said, generations of just like, this is unbelievable. And then you added to it Karloff, and then you add James Whale and all these other characters. Why did you write this as a novel versus like a Eric Larson Devil in the White City type historical story?
Well, to me, it was. I mean, isn't that those films are historical fiction? I was doing the same thing. It's historical fiction.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I think of it as the same as those. Most people ask me why I didn't write it as nonfiction. And I didn't write it as nonfiction because I wanted to, one, I like being a storyteller, not that you can't be in nonfiction, but there's a lot of stuff that there's no record of. Everything I did was based on fact, but I wanted to be able to write scenes that there was no historical record of. Just they may or may not have occurred. So I wrote the scene. And one of the things I've always struggled with, because I do a lot of stuff with historical stuff, is what you can get away with and what you can't get away with manufacturing. And I don't know if you saw, it was a huge hit. There was the play Frost Nixon, that was
Yep.
a big, it was, big hit and Pulitzer Prize. And I remember there's a scene in it. It's a great scene where, they're in the midst of the 2 or 3 days that they're doing those interviews over. And one night Nixon calls David Frost in the middle of the night. And it's a big moment in the play. That never happened. Not even
Yeah.
close. And so it just drove me crazy. It was like, this is won a Pulitzer Prize and it deserves it, but it's like it was just completely manufactured. So I just went, you know what? I'm sorry, nobody is like slamming that for being a work of fiction, and so it was like that is a huge pivotal moment in the entire thing, and it never happened in any way, shape, or form. The writer justified it because he read somewhere that Nixon was known for calling people late at night. Okay. If you can do that, if you can do that and win a Pulitzer Prize, and you should be able to. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that's when I went, you know what? Nobody is criticizing that as for not being a work of nonfiction. Then this is the direction I'm going to go, because I want to tell a story, and sometimes scenes that may or may not have happened are the most interesting.
So you're working on adapting It's Alive for a film, a feature.
Well, no, I would love to. That
Okay.
hasn't happened yet. I would love to. My previous novel, I have a previous novel that for a number of years was in development to be a TV series. It's kind of sputtered, and especially now with the strike. I have a previous novel called The Strange Birth, Short Life, and Sudden Death of Justice Girl, which is about the era of live television in the 1950s in New York. Another interesting historical fact that most people don't know, that when television exploded after World War II, up until the late 50s, there was no such thing as videotape. It didn't exist. Everything you saw on your television was live. It was happening at that moment, most likely most of the time in a studio in New York. And it didn't stop them. They did these incredibly complicated productions, and they were live. And it was just a fascinating little art form that lasted for about 15 years till videotape came in. And that was the end of live TV. And it tells a story about a writer in that era who, through sort of crazy incidents, creates a character called Justice Girl, that kind of a Superman type of character that overnight becomes a sensation. And it's about all the machinations that go on with this story, and kind of the same way that it's a way I like to tell stories. There were 3 points of view in It's Alive. This is told from the point of view of the writer, the actress who plays Justice Girl, and the head of the network. I created a sort of a fourth network based on there used to be a fourth network called the Dumont Network that disappeared in the mid-50s. So this is kind of a Dumont type of network and the struggles that they're having, and suddenly they have this hit show. So I tell it from the point of view of those 3 characters.
It's the eras you're touching on are things that are so incredibly fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's the I love doing research. That's got to be my favorite thing, to the point that I have to stop myself and say, okay, you need to start writing now. You're just reading too much. I enjoy it so much.
It's Alive, No Cameras Allowed, The Strange Birth, Short Life, and Sudden Death of Justice Girl are all available wherever you get your books. For signed copies and for so much more information, check out Julian's website, juliandavidstone.com.
Why the Podcast is produced by the Professional Production Company. Please be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, because we're shallow and need constant validation. For more information, you can check out our website, whythepodcast.com. And like everyone else, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Today's show was recorded and produced by Heidi Hedquist and myself from our world headquarters, located on the 2nd floor of the professional office building, centrally located downtown. Our reluctant executive producers are John Sauvé and Sandy Stone. Our willing producers are Rachel Allen and Randy Jeanette. Our intern is Zach Jackson. This one's for Philippe. Thanks for joining us. Flash, we're coming home.
Nigel, is that you? Are you here, Nigel?